At this point in my career, I've been involved in basically every aspect of sales. I've been an SDR myself, I've helped interview SDR candidates, I've coached SDRs, and now as an enterprise account executive, I have SDRs that are part of my team that are actively working my territory and trying to create meetings for me. So I wanted to make a video about the most common thing I've seen across the board at multiple jobs that I've had. The most common mistake that every SDR makes, I made it myself, all new SDRs make, is something that's easily correctable and just takes a little bit of time and focus on your part. So I think the important thing to note is that the outcome is always the same. There are numerous factors involved that we'll talk about quickly that contribute to this, but the outcome and the number one problem that SDRs always have is always the same thing, and it's attributed to a couple different symptoms. So in short, the number one thing that new SDRs, new salespeople in general, do wrong is that they talk all about themselves when they haven't even identified if their product is even a fit for the person they're talking to. And this manifests itself because of a few different things. One of the biggest things I've had to coach new SDRs on is, yes, the ability to listen without question. There are people who, especially early on, they feel nervous and anxious and they want to talk and they want to explain everything. That's usually the first barrier to be overcome in terms of listening. But also, I think a lot of new salespeople have this misconception, particularly in tech, particularly in B2B sales, that there is like this selling or like charisma that you have to talk about your product and get a bunch of buy-in from different people. And that's just not the case. Like, you can have a great product, you can have something that solves a lot of the problems that someone might be going through, but unless you've actually been able to uncover that, unless you've actually been able to consult them and help them better understand how a product like yours might actually solve the problem, then there's no point in you talking about all the features. And so what this manifests itself as is SDRs, when they're on the phone, let's say you're selling some sort of, cloud computing product, whatever it may be. The second you hear a thing that you've been trained on that is identified as a common reason why people would need your product, you immediately go into your pitch. And what takes some time and what many good SDR managers, etc., will coach their SDRs to do is when you hear that, that's great, but that doesn't mean they've actually experienced that pain in full. That doesn't mean that that problem is significant enough for them to make an actual change. So when you are hearing your customer say a lot of things that align with the benefits of your product, it is not a cue for you to actually go into detail about what your product does. It's a cue for you to ask more questions. So, hey, I see you mentioned you have a problem scaling your current product. I guess what have been some of the challenges? Is that something that you don't think you can solve with your existing software, with your existing hardware product, whatever you're selling? Conversely, like, hey, I know you mentioned you had a lot of downtime with this software product. Is that something you feel you have the ability to address internally? Is there, if that was solved today, what would be the impact of having that issue resolved immediately? And there's no right answer here. Obviously, this is for the sake of example. But when a customer says, hey, I have these problems and it aligns with your product, that is not the time to pitch. That's the time to probe further. What does that pain actually mean? Has that cost them an extra day or overnight session or weekend in the office or on their computer working remotely? Has that caused and inflicted serious enough pain, or are they already aware of how limiting it is given their long-term path for growth? And I can give you a concrete example without giving specific names, but one of the folks that I worked with in my first sales job, they were having an issue scaling a software that was a serious limitation. They were an e-commerce company and they were coming up on Black Friday. So if all I did was say, hey, like, we can scale, we can meet your needs, we can do all this, I mean, that's great. So that's no different than what the other 5 vendors that they were talking to were talking about. The knee-jerk reaction is to say, great, we can solve that, when can we start? But the reality is, like, they are so invested in this product, they spent multiple years building it with their existing solution. You can't just come in and say, hey, we've got what you need, let's do it now. You have to better understand that and say, hey, I know you have issues scaling, you're coming up on Black Friday. What does that mean? Like, when you're an e-commerce company, when you're coming up on Black Friday, I mean, how much of an increase in traffic are you expecting on your website, your application, whatever it may be? And then they might give you an answer. And again, we're not pitching at that point. We're still waiting. We're loading another question. We know that scaling is an issue. We have a better idea of what kind of scaling they need to get to. And yes, we know our product can solve that, but now let's dive in further. So in addition to scaling, in other years where you've had an increase in traffic like this, what are some, are there other problems in addition to the scaling that you may have? Do you have an issue around your website staying up? Has it ever crashed? These are types of questions you can keep digging into. You let them talk, you let them voice the pain, and then, and only then, once you have all that information, you tie it to the features of the product. So that was a really long way of saying the number one thing that SDRs do incorrectly is talk all about their product. But again, not only do they talk all about the product, especially if you're very early on, I'm as guilty as anyone, I did this when I first started. You'll call and you'll just say, hey, this is what we do, would that be relevant to you? And you haven't established any idea of what the customer's actual pains are. Then you see a video like this, you talk to a manager or whatever it may be, and they say, hey, ask more questions before pitching the product. But then what happens is, okay, like you have that mental note in your mind, and then what happens is you get on a call and you call someone and ask them that question, like, hey, I was just wondering, do you have any problem scaling? And they're like, yeah, actually that's something we want to address probably in the next 6 to 12 months. And then instead of pausing and asking more questions, understanding their criteria, why they even want to scale in the first place, even though you asked a question, like your manager said, like this video recommended, you still go immediately to that pitch. So it takes some time, and I don't say this as a critique, this is something that you just have to learn and fail, and it's why salespeople are compensated accordingly, because it's a very difficult thing to do in real time. But again, the number one thing that SDRs don't do correctly is they talk all about their product without fully understanding even if it's a fit and how it can solve their prospect's problem. So I hope that helps. I appreciate everyone's time watching, and if you did find value in this video, would really appreciate it if you like, subscribe, share with other SDR team members, whoever it may be. But thanks again, and we'll see you next week.